Attending via Zoom, welcome. Glad you guys are with us. We hope, again, that this time is going to be beneficial to you. We trust that it will. And knowing how busy everybody is, we've all experienced the backlog of work, both on both sides of the counter, really. And so the intent of what we're trying to do here today is to, again, make the process more efficient for everybody involved, so that it's going to be a benefit for you and your customers, as well as a benefit for us as we're processing the work too. So thank you again for attending and welcome. Just as a little bit of a recap of the last couple years, and this isn't a surprise to any one of you guys, but just to give you a sense as to what we've been experiencing from 2019, we have, from up until 2021, we have an 80% increase in the amount of minor subdivision requests. That's a lot of work. And so what has, again, prompted us to do is to see how we can find ways of being more efficient in how we do business, again, helping you in return. So we don't know what to expect for 2022. I've heard from a number of you guys, we're just turning away work. We're over our limit. We're busting at the seams. And so we don't know what to expect, but I guess we'll kind of work through this together. We're on pace right now to have a similar year as last year, which was, again, the most we've had on record. So this morning, what we're going to do is have our project planners introduce themselves along with different parts of their presentation. And so we're going to be talking about exempt divisions of land. We're going to be talking about lot consolidations, minor amendments, minor subdivision, condo plats, major subdivisions, and then general standards, as well as you guys are familiar, we have recently transitioned from Trackit to IMS. And so we'll be going through IMS a little bit just to kind of, again, make sure everybody is aware, and we can maybe work out some kinks along the way. Kind of as I mentioned, this is kind of what we're going to be expecting for today. So with that, as kind of continuing with the same thought, and I meant to mention this earlier, because there is so much work that we have experienced, we have some transition periods with staff. We have hired 2 new planners. One of them is with us today. One will be starting next Monday. And so given the amount of work that we've received, and as you know, we have been backlogged with some of our pre-application meetings, with our submittals, and so we appreciate your guys' patience as we've been working through this. As you've probably been told, right now we're looking at about 5 to 6 weeks when we're scheduling those pre-apps, and sometimes as long for new submittals. So when we get an application for a new submittal, it's taking staff a while just to get to the point where we are able to pick it up and start our completion and sufficiency review. So again, appreciate all your patience in this. I trust that as we bring staff in and train them up, that should wane as we get people trained. So again, appreciate your patience on that. We really do appreciate it. So with that, I will have our first presenter, Greg Norris, and newest member of the team, start us off. So thanks, Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg. I'm the new guy. Nice to meet all of you. So I'm going to get started here with exempt divisions and lot consolidation. All right, the clicker worked exactly how I want. Oh, no, it didn't. There we go. Okay, sweet. We're ready now. All right, so when we're thinking about subdivision exemptions, the 2 things I'm really going to dig into here today are boundary line adjustments and large lot divisions. But as we can see on the list, there are a few other things in there. So burial plots, conveyances to public entities, conveyances to conservation organizations, decedents' estates, eminent domain, and court orders. So those are some of the things that you might see as an exemption for subdivision. And I'm going to open up here with boundary line adjustments. So the most important part of boundary line adjustments is that there are no additional or contiguous parcels made from that boundary line adjustment. They need to meet the minimum size, and in the end result cannot be separated by a public road or public approved private right-of-way. It can also happen on parcels that are platted and unplatted. So, continuing with boundary line adjustments, BLAs, as you'll hear us say sometimes, are not permitted for parcels that are ineligible for permits or created improperly. And we find that out through research when we sit down and the pre-application process, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. Now, it's important that boundary line adjustments, there needs to be a recordation of each change made to the parcel as a result. So for property that's transferred, as an example, or property that is received. So there's an important piece of that puzzle where we need to know somewhere in that article that there's a recordation of each change and that it and what change it's created and what effect it will or will not have on that change. All right. We'll head into large lot divisions. And you'll see here that I sort of have an example on the right side where parcels need to be at least 40 acres in size. Parcels created cannot be more than or less than 20 acres in size, including a 3% deviation. The gross acreage can't be applied to this, and parcels created under this exemption or a predecessor thereof cannot be reduced below 20 minus the 3% acres via boundary line adjustment. So we'll move into lot consolidations. Lot consolidations, consolidation of a platted lot. There's a $50 application fee. There will be some interdepartment coordination. And we want to make sure that it's the appropriate process, meaning that it differs from a combination request with the assessor. Those are typically done as a tax purpose. So this form can only be used, the form we see here off to the right, can only be used in the county. This one doesn't apply to the cities. All right, so lot consolidations continued. Lot consolidation does not alter the interior easement or plat restrictions. If an easement or plat restriction interferes with the desired goal, there may be a need to address via amendment or relocation process versus a lot consolidation. I'm going to open that first part up to questions. No, not a word.
And then what I'll also offer is that if anybody on Zoom has a question, you could go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and take it away.
Cool. All right, yeah.
This may be an off-the-wall question, but for example, if you were adjusting the lot line, there was an easement involved on the original lot line, but with the adjustment, the easement remained in the building setback of the adjusted lot. Would that be allowed to let the easement straddle the property?
What that sort of meant in that slide was that the lot consolidation, if there are easements or setbacks, maybe lot consolidation wouldn't be the best way to put that land together.
No, I was trying to drag you down.
Okay.
About easements, you know.
Sure.
Hey Bart, is your question with regards to adjustments over an easement and the result being separated by that easement?
Yeah, maybe, I think what you're saying is that the easements remain regardless of the consolidation. And if they conflict
Correct, yeah. So if we're talking about an easement on the face of plat, then a boundary line adjustment is not going to change the location of that easement. So if that's kind of what you're meaning with on the face of plat, or is it an unplatted situation?
That's it. And if the boundary line adjustment didn't affect the use of the easement, use of the other lot, it would be okay for the easement to stay the same with the lot line changing.
I don't see that there be any issue with that, but.
That's okay, yeah. Thank you for asking.
Can I just really clarify just
Yeah.
one quick thing?
Hit it, Vlad.
Morning, everybody. Bart, I think in general, when you, or when anybody proposes a boundary line adjustment that shifts the common line between two adjoining parcels, the underlying encumbrances that are on each of those lots remain as is. They don't change, they are not eliminated. The configuration of those encumbrances, whether it's an easement or plat restriction, whether it's lot coverage or anything else that legally encumbers that property or those two lots, remains as is. And Greg is gonna get into the specifics of what can be done in order to modify those encumbrances outside of a BLA.
And sorry, I meant to, I got a chat note here. If we could repeat the questions so that people on Zoom could hear, okay?
Sure.
So the question essentially that Bart had asked was, if there is a boundary line adjustment to platted lots, does that change or have any effect to the easements within the plat? And I think that was essentially the question.
Hand over the mic. Yeah.
So with platted lots, Kootenai County, with any adjustment of property lines or anything like that, you guys don't require replats? Like with the boundary line adjustment, you can essentially just go through a boundary line adjustment through what's like a record of survey, or?
So a boundary line adjustment would need to be recorded and resurveyed. So surveyed, then recorded as a boundary line adjustment.
Record of survey, you wouldn't have to do it through a plat, or are we doing a replat?
I'm gonna defer to staff on this one.
So just to clarify, a boundary line adjustment does not have to have a record of survey. It may, but it doesn't have to, but it has to have a deed of conveyance. And that deed of conveyance would accurately address the new legal boundary of the two parcels involved. So in some cases, a record of survey may be helpful if you're doing meets and bounds description, but in some cases, if you're adjusting aliquot parts, then you may just use the aliquot parts in your legal description in the deed of conveyance without having a record of survey. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Where we deal with the majority of the time, anytime anything in a plat is being altered, notes or their parcel lines, lot lines, or anything, we require a replat in a lot of the places we work. So this is just very different for us. So like, can we do
So
Sure.
I think you're accurate partially in your assessment. We do, in the past, prior to an amendment to our code in 2016, there were regulations that specified that an adjustment exceeding 20% change, a ratio of 20% change to the perimeter of the existing parcels or lots would require a replat. That has since been changed to be a little bit more flexible. But as Greg will discuss, there are some components of changes to the plat that do require amendments. It's clearly not something that you can just do via deed.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Cool. Then we have another question in the back.
So with the boundary line adjustment, if a licensed surveyor is involved in creating that, monuments have to be set, record of survey filed, as state law requires. So even though if you don't require that, if a licensed surveyor is involved, it has to be done.
Scott, can you clarify? So if somebody is adjusting boundaries, if the legal description is an eloquent part, an attorney can't come up with a legal description, they need to have it surveyed?
No, I just said if the licensed surveyor is involved. the licensed surveyor is required to follow the state law, which requires monuments to be set on a regular survey plot.
Got it.
And thank you for that. That's helpful for staff to know. When we are talking with people about boundary line adjustments, because that question does come up, is a survey required? That will be helpful for us to tell them if you choose to use a survey, because it isn't required by county code. But if you choose to, then you would likely expect those things to happen. So thanks, Scott.
And I went back to the boundary line adjustment slide. I think I skipped over this one, so I just kind of wanted everybody to see that, and that kind of adds a little depth to the questions that happen. Any more questions on this section? Yeah.
So lot consolidations, kind of piggybacking what Vlad was saying about boundary line adjustments.
Mhm.
So when you consolidate two lots, let's say one's platted, one's not,
Sure.
does the encumbrances from both of them merge together into that newly created lot?
I'm going to say the answer to that is yes. Vlad, do you have anything to add?
They do remain. So those encumbrances, legal encumbrances that affect the underlying property remain. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Everybody good? Cool. Oh, another one, yeah.
Just like, just give it a toss. I believe it's still in the ordinance that discusses using the 3D method for doing a boundary line adjustment. When I've had them reviewed by the county seems okay with the 1D method, where you basically say the existing owners own this parcel and this parcel. This is the parcel being transferred, and for purpose of boundary line adjustment, it's now this parcel, so it'll handle 1D. Because it's written as in the ordinances using 3Ds, I've had attorneys that have had concerns with doing the 1D method, even though I guess what I've seen is that's a much cleaner method of doing it. I presume the county doesn't have an issue with the 1D, and is there any discussion of trying to clean up the ordinance to fix that issue?
Ben?
Good point. Yes, we've had a number of conversations with the assessors, with the recorder's office, and nobody is opposed to the 1D method. And so as long as it's clear and unambiguous that the intent is for boundary line adjustments, you have the descriptions for both parcels or however many parcels are involved, then it is possible to do that via 1D. So that may be a point for us to then clean up in our code. So.
Good. All right, I'm going to move us into the next section. Thank you guys for asking some good questions there, giving us some clarity. So, everything we're going to talk about for the next couple of sections is going to involve a pre-application process. Now, basically, the pre-application process is going to be the first step in the land use application. And it's going to discuss the requirements and feasibility of the proposal of the application. So holding a pre-application meeting won't guarantee approval. There might be some follow-up required, and it's important that we note that pre-application meetings are not binding or vesting. All right, so let's talk a little bit about minor amendments and relocations. So relocations are changes which affect the location of private roads, common driveways, things like that. It doesn't constitute substantial change, and all affected property owners must be consented. So I've got a little diagram here. Might be hard to see in the back, but up at the top we've got an existing access that has been moved down to the middle there in the darker dotted lines. And this is just to illustrate how a relocation would work. So a minor amendment is a correction or a change in the wording that doesn't affect the vested rights of any owners or those who have any legal interest in that parcel. It also doesn't constitute a substantial change. Now, we've heard substantial change a few times. We'll talk about that right now. So substantial change is changing the location of a private road, common driveway, all of those things, unless all affected property owners have consented to this movement. Location of public roads, creating additional lots, any significant changes in the wording that would affect vested rights. Substantial changes require major, minor, or a condo plat. And so we have an example here where we used a minor amendment to change a building envelope as well as the impervious area. So we just made that area a little bit bigger. It kind of shows you by the arrows there what happened. So the processes for minor amendments and relocation. Now, as I mentioned a little bit ago, each process will start with a pre-application meeting. And here's an example of what the minor amendment and relocation applications look like for the checklist portion. It'll be at the bottom. And you'll note that as we go forward, they look very similar. I'm going to see a couple of things that look very similar, but maybe a hair different. So, in the approval procedure, you'll see that we start to see that minor amendment is a little bit more involved than relocation. Relocation was designed to sort of be an easier process. A minor amendment versus a relocation, the approval procedure, we see more of this, little bit of that heavy lifting on minor amendment, relocation a little bit lighter. And let me know if I'm going too fast. Yep, I did. I skipped one. So the order of decision and the order of decision required findings. This again, we'll see in the way things sort of lay out between the two that there are some differences in how that's done. And this is mostly, these few slides are mostly to illustrate and give a little bit more knowledge on what those things are and what would be the best solution. And so finally, in the fees, we see minor amendment being a little bit more costly than a relocation. So considering that idea could be a really important thing to do. All right, let's open it up for questions.
I do have one question, clarifying question from Zoom, talking about the relocation process. The question primarily is focused on the difference between a vacation and a relocation. So the question here essentially is that the first relocation application process that this person went through was actually a vacation of an easement. So just want to clarify the vacations are not relocations and would not go through this process moving forward, correct?
Right.
That is correct.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, Todd, did you have something, Bud?
I'd like to clarify something, Ben. I think, I don't know what specifically the individual is referring to, because as we know, road vacations have to go potentially through a public hearing. Specifically, private road vacations have to go through potentially a public hearing process. Public roads have to go through the highway district with jurisdiction review process. And the specific steps of a road vacation are significantly different of those that are of a relocation. So there is a distinction between simple easements, whether they're utility easement or an access easement for individual use versus a bona fide private road easement.
Cool. Any more questions or thoughts on that subject? All right, not a one. So I'm going to move us on. And we'll be talking about minor subdivisions and plats and bring up Rebecca Perkins. Thank you guys for your time.
Good morning. I am Rebecca Perkins. I've been working in current planning for about a year. If you never worked on a minor subdivision, you may not know who I am, but I have been working here. I'll be talking about mostly minor subdivisions, a little bit about condo plats at the end. The reason for that is we get probably twice as many minor subdivision applications as all the other applications combined. So this is the bulk of the applications we're getting. I'll talk about a little bit about applicability, submittals, the process, and then at the end, some tips for success. I should note, this is going to be brief. This does not count as a pre-application meeting. You still have to do that for your projects. So minor subdivisions are when you're subdividing a lot into 4 or fewer lots. The original lot does count as one of those 4. So this one was originally 1 lot. They split it into 2. That's a 2-lot minor subdivision. This is an administrative process. Does not go to the hearing examiner, public hearing, and then it does not go to the Board of County Commissioners unless it is appealed. And that's after we've made the administrative decision. And a little clarification about the 4 or fewer lots, that is within 5 years. So if you have a 20-acre rural parcel, you split it into 2 10s via the minor subdivision process. You're only creating 2. Those can both be further subdivided within the 5 years because you can only create 4 total out of that. If you have a 25-acre rural parcel and you split it into 3 5s and a 10, you've already maxed out your 4. You have to wait 5 years to re-subdivide the 10-acre parcel. Quickly, there are mandatory application requirements, and then there are some that depend on the circumstances, whether or not there are steep slopes or the other things that require geotechnical analysis, or whether there are wetlands. And then occasionally there are some other things that are in other parts of the code that you need to give us to help us out, or if you're in an unmapped A zone for flood, there's some other things that you need in order to meet code requirements. This is probably the most complicated part of the actual submittal process, giving these to us online. We will talk about that during the IMS section. And also, quick note, groundwater quantity report or will serve letter from a water district. We'll talk about that again. So of the application requirements, the preliminary initial plat, there's a whole table that in the code that has what's needed at initial plat and what's needed at final plat. You can go through that and make sure that you have everything on both plats just using that table. We usually don't go into too much detail in pre-application meetings about the actual surveying details about that. That's something that Rodney, our county surveyor, would review, and we're not surveyors, so we're not checking the lot closures. Also, related to this, what's not listed in our application requirements are the things that our county surveyor needs. Typically, surveyors know that they need to give those to us. We're not going to argue if you tell us you don't need it. That's for Rodney to decide. For the narrative, it needs to address all the code requirements so that we can make our required findings in our order of decision. Also keep in mind that this is not just for us to read. It's also helpful for neighbors that might be reading it, people in the future, the property owner in the future, also the agencies use it to get their information. So it's a great place to explain unusual circumstances that you can't explain on a plat. A reason for this plat note, if you're doing building envelopes because the property owner wants that, this is a good way to, or a good place to explain that. We don't say that in the code that you have to explain unusual things. That's just kind of the best place to put it. This is the equivalent of our kind of staff analysis section of the order decision, where we're explaining unusual things that we might be requiring, or just reasons for certain decisions. These are also really helpful if we're getting into the minor amendment relocation process. If there's an easement on there and an unusual easement, if we explain it in the narrative, we can see, oh, the owner just wanted this because of a view. And then it helps us decide how we go about moving it or changing it. Or the other option is, if there's nothing in the narrative, it's going to be explained in our staff analysis of the county required this for whatever reason. So that helps us out in the future. Next, probably the easiest submittal, site photographs and a key showing us where you took them. This helps because a lot of the photographs are just trees. So it shows us that you're not showing us these same trees. The whole parcel is just trees. These are, again, same thing. It's helpful for agencies to decide if they want to go out there. It's helpful in the future. It's helpful for property owners to see what's going on at the time of submittal. If you're looking like you're going to submit late fall or winter, it's very helpful if you give us photos before there's snow on the ground, especially if it's just like a flat harvested hayfield and it's just pictures of snow. Then we can actually see, oh, it's a flat harvested hayfield. It's not a gravel parking lot underneath there. For the well submittals, we do need a groundwater quantity report prepared by a professional geologist. If you're not over the Rathrum Prairie Aquifer, that also needs to include hydrogeological details. We have a list of hydrogeologists that we can give you if you don't know any, or you can just find someone if they're not on the list and are willing to do it, which is sometimes an issue. Again, if you're not doing shared or individual wells, so that's wells that are serving 9 or fewer, then you can give us a will serve letter from the water district, and Amy will have a little more details about these in the general standards section. We need a contour map and a slope category map. On the right here is our kind of slope category map. We don't rely on it. It gives us a general idea of what's going on the lot. But this is kind of why in your pre-application meeting you might need to give us the slope submittals, but we are going to rely on your slope category map to tell us that, because we know ours is wrong a lot. Please make sure it does actually match the site. I have had a couple times where someone tells me in the narrative it might say there's a flat building lot or building area on this lot. There's nothing on the slope category map. There's nothing on the contour map. So then you have to do a revision either to the narrative or to these submittals to actually match what's on the site. We also would like you to actually use the slope categories that we have in the code. It's everything less than 15, between 15 and 35, and greater than 35. If it's all less than 15, you do not need to give us other categories. It kind of makes it look like your site is more sloped than it is. If it's all less than 15, you can just put a note on the contour map. It's all less than 15 slope. It's all one category. We have absolutely no problem with that. Moving into that, we're using this slope category map to determine whether or not we need the additional slope submittals. Amy will also go into more details about these, but these are the conceptual engineering, conceptual stormwater, site disturbance plan, and the geotechnical analysis. So this is if there is land disturbing activity proposed in areas with 15% slopes or greater. That means if you're creating a building lot, you are proposing some amount of activity. So there needs to be area for a driveway connecting to wherever the road or common driveway going to this lot is, connecting it to the building pad. So that all of that needs to be less than 15%. in order to not need these submittals. Geotechnical analysis also can be required in a couple other scenarios. If there's a high water table or there's just evidence of erosion are the two. These are hard for us to tell you at a pre-app. Some things that you can find to let you know that there's a high water table are weird little pockets of wetlands. There could be a letter from the Panhandle Health District in the title report from, I think, the 70s that says you're going to have some issues with septic. It might be because of high water table. And then also test holes from Panhandle Health District might say, looks like there's evidence that the water table is only 2 feet below ground level at some point of the year, and that would be a high water table. We talked about if for land disturbing activity, that is driveways and building pads. So if your building pad area is not less than 15%, it does need to be included in the engineering and site disturbance plan. So this is a good example of conceptual engineering that does include a conceptual house and how that would work on the site. We know you're not going to have the actual house plans, probably. So starting into the process, the first kind of 2 steps after you have your pre-application meeting and actually submit are this submittal meeting that's referenced in the code and in handouts sometimes. We don't do a formal submittal meeting anymore. It waits in our queue until we can get to it. Try to get to it as fast as we can. And then we are checking to make sure that you're submitting everything, and that also nothing major has changed since you've submitted it. So if a code change came in since your pre-application meeting, we're going to talk to you about that if it affects your project, to decide if you still want to submit or if you need to change something, or if there's some other thing that will affect your project. So if anyone has submitted a project within the boundary of the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Reservation and you had your pre-application meeting before they started telling us they were denying those, we talk to you when we get that submittal and tell you should talk to the tribe at this point. We don't want to just pretend like we don't know that they're probably going to deny it and have you pay us fees. We don't rather tell you at that point. So that's the purpose of the submittal meeting. And then after that, we do the actual review details, all of that. We use the code as a checklist, so you can also use the code to check to make sure that you're submitting a sufficient application. Next, it moves on to the review period, goes to agency review and public review, both 30 days, or public comment about the same time. The agency review starts when we set their reviews in IMS, so that can start 1 p.m. on a Tuesday. Public comment does not start until the legal notice is published in the newspaper, so that's usually delayed a little bit. The picture is showing you the buffer around a property, the 300-foot buffer, so it's around the entire property that's being subdivided. And the people who are sent comment in the mail is anyone who owns even a sliver of land in that 300-foot buffer. So you'll see here, there's a neighbor to the north that just has a little corner, another one that has a little sliver within that 300 feet, so they still are sent comment. Anyone who finds out about this, reads it in the newspaper, or hears about it from a neighbor, anyone can still comment on a project. If there are ever specific concerns before you submit, you hear from neighbors, or if you're reading the public comments in the file, if you have concerns about if they might change things, you can always contact us at that point and we can talk to you about them. We don't assume that there are going to be issues unless there was also another project recently that had a bunch of negative public comments. For the agency review and the pre-application meeting, we're probably going to tell you to talk to the agencies beforehand. It's usually at least one of 4 reasons why. Might be just basically, we're going to go to the agencies, you can talk to them beforehand. If we're talking to property owners, we're usually telling them to talk to agencies to help them cost out how much the project's going to cost, because especially for potential road improvements or fees in lieu of road improvements, that cost can be quite a big chunk of the project. Certainly more than our $2,000 we charge for a minor subdivision. If you have one of the agencies that typically takes longer than 30 days, we'll probably tell you to talk to them beforehand. Sometimes you can get it pre-approved. And then finally, if we think there's going to be a major issue, we'll direct you to that agency. In that case, if you're having issues getting in touch with an agency, maybe they want the full application, you can contact us. Again, if we think the agency is going to deny the project, we tell you that at the pre-application meeting. We would like to help you work that out, get an answer before you apply, before you spend all the money on groundwater report, all of that. Otherwise, during the comment period, we don't usually step in if you just need to submit an application to Panhandle Health District. Once we're done with the comment period, whichever comment period ends last, which is usually the public comment period, it starts our 35-day clock that's in our code to issue the order decision. If we need more than 35 days to meet our findings, which is usually someone's still working on the application, you're working out details with the agencies, we're going to ask you to waive this so that we can actually approve it. So we do not ask you to waive this if we're just like, I'm too busy, I didn't get around to it. That's not why we are going to ask you to waive it. If we will get these orders done if we have everything we need to issue the findings. But we don't want to deny something that can be approved if you just need a couple more weeks. This is an administrative process, so these are signed by David Callahan, our director. And they always include conditions of approval. Sometimes these conditions are do whatever you need to do to get the agencies to sign the plat, comply with fire district standards when you build, that type of thing. Sometimes they're more complex. So make sure when we send you the order that you're reading the conditions of approval, because most of those will need to be met prior to giving the Mylars to our surveyor. So you give them to us, we will sit on them until we meet all those conditions, unless the condition is specifically at time of building or at time of CO. So once it's approved or denied, it starts a 28-day period in which it can be appealed. It can be appealed by owners. It can be appealed by affected parties. We will not let you record in that 28 days, but you can, if it's approved, you can start working on the Mylars. You can take them around and get them signed. We just will not take them to Rodney in the first step of the county signatures during that 28 days. If you think it's going to be appealed, maybe you don't want to start that process, but you can. We do have a time limit. You need to record them within a year, but if something comes up, you have a reason that you couldn't record it within a year. This is usually building a road. You can ask for an extension to that period. And again, we are checking conditions of approval at this time, so you can go ahead and check them before you give us the Mylars. Next, some tips for success. The first one is if you have questions, ask. If you have questions right after the pre-application meeting, you can ask them. If you have, you forgot to ask it during the pre-application meeting. If you have the contour and slope category map done and you don't know whether or not you're going to need the slope category or the slope submittals, you can ask us then. If you're wondering about things that deal with the design standards, lot lines, that type of thing, working on the plat, you can ask us at that point. You're probably going to have a lot smoother application process if you ask us before you submit than if you submit thinking that, kind of hoping for the best. There are definitely certain areas of the county where there are lots of minors that can get through very, very smoothly because they're just very uncomplicated. But otherwise, please ask. For an example, I have two projects that are in comment right now. One was submitted 6 months before the other. That's the difference between kind of working some of these details out before you submit can be. Next, please read the title report before you submit, specifically for CC&Rs that would limit subdivision. If you're reading it and you're not sure, you can ask us. We'll probably run it by our legal counsel. We are also talking to a group of realtors next week. We're definitely going to bring that up because if someone's buying a lot solely to subdivide, they should definitely be reading their title report before they even buy the property. But you should also check for easements, limitations, all those need to be on the plat. As we kind of went over, speak with agencies first. If you're next to public road, and check to see if the highway district's going to need right-of-way. I know they won't give you a full review usually, but specific questions you can usually get answered. I will sometimes go to the highway district if I don't know if they're going to impose their 75-foot building envelope, and I think it's going to be an issue if they do. So sometimes you can get a answer to a specific question beforehand. Also, private roads, feel free to check with the fire districts to make sure that they meet their standards beforehand, because that can be a pretty big process. And Panhandle Health District will let you start their process before. Next, please proofread the application submittals. Make sure that all the documents referencing the same proposal. We don't have one that says that there's going to be individual wells, one that says there's going to be shared wells. This includes reading the groundwater quantity report, reading geotechnical analyses, that type of thing. If your groundwater quantity report says this needs to be a shared well, everything else needs to say that it's going to be a shared well. And then sometimes there's things in the geotechnical report that need to be on the conceptual site disturbance or stormwater plan. And then the next few things are make sure you're submitting a complete application in the IMS section. We'll go over how you can check to see what you actually submitted and how you can swap out documents. And please make sure it's actually sufficient because corrections are what add time to the project. We have so many projects. I can't get to corrections the day you send them to me. Sometimes it can take me 2 weeks to get to them. If I have a bunch of orders I need to write, again, I'm not going to tell someone they need to waive the 35-day period because I'm working on someone else's project on corrections. We have that 35-day clock. If we can write it, we will write it. That's the end of the minor subdivision section. I'm going to quickly talk about condo plots, and then if we have questions for either one, we can do that at the end. So first I have 3 types of condo plots. This is a pretty traditional light industrial condo plots where you kind of have mini storage, but instead of renting out the mini storage, you want to sell the units. So garage town type condo. This is a traditional residential condo plat. Just a building with units in it that, again, the units are sold. The land is not with the units. It's under common ownership. This is a bunch of single-family homes. This is still a condo plat because the single-family homes are not sold together with their own lots. It's just the units of the houses. So there are different options for condominium plats. This is in Article 6.5 of the Land Use and Development Code, and it's when you have the differences in the owner of the land and the structures. The key thing for condo plats is you basically should have your building designed before you submit. If you submit a condo plat for a rectangular building, that building needs to be rectangular when you apply for the building permit. So if you are submitting for, on the left, 2-story duplex, maybe you're submitting, it's supposed to have 8 2-story duplexes. You cannot then submit building permits for 3-story townhomes, 8 together. Yes, it's still 16 units, completely different building structure. The number of floors matters. whether or not they're attached or detached matter, and even like the little shapes of the buildings matter. So it's a 3D structure that you are defining the legal area of on the plat. If you come in with a different building permit, the plat has to be changed. We understand that there are some very old condo plats that they have not completely built the buildings for. They really should have built them right after they had the condo plat recorded, but we're not blaming anyone when that happens. We just want to warn you beforehand. This is grouped together with minor subdivisions because it's basically the same process. It's just the findings are different. So it's still an administrative process, but it is slightly different. So the findings are going to be different. So do we have questions about minor subdivisions or condo plats? Yes.
Could you explain, please, when building envelopes are required on minor subdivisions?
They're required when we have a reason to make it so that some areas cannot be built on. So if you do not give us a full contour map, we're going to ask, if you don't want to give us a full contour map, you need to have building envelopes for the area that you gave us the contour for, because we need to make sure that it's livable and has reasonable utility. There can be sometimes with sensitive areas where we also might need building envelopes. We try to warn you about this at a pre-app. More recently, things have been coming up. We've had development in areas that we haven't been developing in. It's coming up more often, but it's hard to tell you exactly when they're required in all circumstances right now.
About if you're on the prairie and the property's completely flat, do we still need full contours?
The contours
and slope category?
The contours are what tell us that it's flat. That's what we use to tell us. And usually if it's flat, the slope category is just going to say it's less than 15. You can just put that note on there. But if it's flat, I would expect one contour line maybe 2 or 3. They're 5-foot contours. If it's completely flat, that's what it should look like. And I would not expect building envelopes unless there's occasionally people are building next to a mining site and there might be something. But usually we don't have that.
Is it possible in a minor subdivision to create just one lot and leave the balance of the property unbuildable?
I don't think you'd need to go through the minor subdivision process for that. You could just do like an easement that makes it non-buildable. If you're creating new lots, that's what the purpose of the subdivision process is. Usually we only see one lot minor subdivisions if it's correcting a illegal division. So if you're not intending to create more buildable lots than you already have, you probably don't need to go through the minor subdivision process.
What if the other lot that's non-buildable is a gravel pit?
Just to clarify, Scott, I think when you are creating standalone bona fide meets and bounds legal description of 2 separate lots, regardless of underlying uses, whether it's a gravel pit or any other operation, when you're creating 2 different legal descriptions through means of dividing land, or some folks say, the term I have seen used, we just want to break them up. Well, breaking something up and creating 2 closed meets and bound descriptions is an actual subdivision, regardless of use, and therefore it's a subdivision process. So if you have a parent parcel that has an existing mining operation and you want to create 2 separate physical entities, one lot for this use and one for the other, then you have to go through a subdivision process. So the use doesn't alleviate you from having to go through a formal subdivision review.
But if the lot that is unbuildable, would you need to do all of the conceptual engineering and topo and so forth?
When you're saying
If you're just
unbuildable,
designating it as an unbuildable lot, it's
Are
gonna
you
remain as a
designating it?
gravel pit or whatever.
are you designating it,
Yes.
or is it already designated based on the underlying plat?
No,
Are you
no, you're
re-subdividing?
creating a plat, you're doing a minor subdivision, but you're creating one lot that's unbuildable. Because it's a gravel pit, say,
With an existing conditional use permit?
yes.
So that's a pretty unique circumstance. If you're creating, first of all, a conditional use permit is not a by right use. It's a conditional use. So if you are requesting to remove a by right use and make it solely for what it's currently being operated as, we would have to review that. I'm inclined to say that if you have a restriction, either via disclaimer on the face of plat or through a separate instrument number like a CCNR that says lot 1 is for residential use of Scott's Estates, and lot 2 will be unbuildable and retain solely the rights of an approved conditional use permit for a mining operation, then it's likely that we will not require any further assessment of reasonable utility and livability with that in mind. But you're asking a question that I have not seen come across ever. It's a pretty rare, unique circumstance, so we would have to further evaluate that. But if you are, stating that there's a disclaimer that restricts use for what's there without any future allowance for and by right permitted use of residential, and I'm talking about residential, or I'm talking about residential zoning. If you're talking about like light industrial zoning, then of course a residential use is not permitted in that in the first place. But if you're talking about ag sub, restricted residential, rural, then we would have to further evaluate that.
Okay, thank you. One more question. How about the latest on subdividing in the Coeur d'Alene tribe? Any updates?
We haven't had any updates, yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to that. At this point, we've been in conversation with the tribe. As you are all aware, we were as surprised to see a change in their policy as you are. And so we were caught off guard as well. But we have been trying to engage with the tribe. At this point, there is no official change in their position. And so at this time, again, they are sending us denials for those requests during the agency comment period. So we'll certainly keep you posted when more information becomes available, if something does change, because we want to make sure that you guys are aware.
We definitely have not forgotten about those projects that are on hold. We want to come up with either something changes or a definite answer to that. Yes.
You discussed that if you only provide a partial topo, that you might consider building envelopes at that point. Traditionally, I haven't seen building envelopes required at that point, and if somebody buys the parcel and wants to demonstrate that they could build in a different area and do the additional work to show that that's a feasible process, that's been allowed. So then if you were to put a building envelope on, how do they work outside that building envelope to show that they can build in this other area, or is that almost kicking in like a replat because they put this building envelope on there?
That's where we get into the minor amendment or relocation process if you put the building envelope. So this usually happens when we have obviously usually pretty large sloped property. If there is a area that makes the most sense to have as a building pad, other areas would be very difficult to get to. And really, if someone really wanted to spend extraordinary amount of money to build there, yes, maybe they'd want to work outside a building envelope, but otherwise you give us the contours for the entire property if you don't want us to impose the building envelope at that point.
But traditionally, the standard has been with the county that we just have to demonstrate that the lot is buildable. Now you're almost demonstrating that this is the only option that is available. And it seems like far more restrictive than what the ordinance has been in the past and how it's been applied. Whereas traditionally it's been, we just have to show that it is feasible to build somewhere on the property, either under 15% grade or, or with reasonable engineering it could be done. Now you're going a step further where you're saying, well, this is your only option unless you want to produce every possible scenario under the sun that could possibly happen.
So there's two parts that we're looking at. For the 15%, we just need to show that there is an area to build less than 15%. The contour and slope category map requirement is in part of the plat table. It does not say show us that there is areas of less than 15% slope by giving us a contour and slope category map. It says provide contours for the property. So the way we've been working around, if you really do not want to give us that requirement, we will have a building envelope because you're not showing us what's going on the rest of the property. I think Ben wants to elaborate.
Yeah, maybe I'll add just a thought. Part of what we're doing too is the purpose is creating lots of reasonable utility and livability, and also that we're not creating some kind of unreasonable burden on a future property owner. And so what the responsibility of the developer is to show, with the submittal of this contour map and slope category map, that there are areas, of course, that can be conceptually built on. And if that is areas of less than 15% or not, then you would show one way or another. But if there are areas that exceed 15%, then you'll know that we'll have a plat note saying that should a property owner decide to build in areas that exceed 15%, then they'll be required to have a geotechnical analysis and site disturbance and so on. And so what that does is that it puts the future property owner on notice saying that, look, I know what I'm getting if I buy this lot. That if I decide to build over there, then I know the slopes exceed 15%, and I will be expected, based on the plat note, that I'm going to be required to do a geotechnical analysis. So it puts both staff and the future property owners on notice that no matter where you build, there's an expectation of what is going to be required of you.
And the note makes sense, although every time I put that note on the past, I've had the planners told me to pull it off before we recorded, so I'm not sure quite how that fits in with how that's happened traditionally, but I understand putting the note on there that beware, a buyer beware type notice, but a building envelope's a much further restriction than that, where now you're basically having to go back and redo the plat just to say, okay, I know I want to build over here. Where even if we do a topo of the entire property, if we only demonstrate one scenario that, okay, you can put a house here and you can, get a conceptual grading plan, that still doesn't prove anything for the rest of the property just because we shot topo on it, which is very subjective to that point in time. And if they come to build 10 years later, they still need a new topo and do analysis of the site.
Sure, and so kind of reinforcing what Rebecca was saying earlier is that if there isn't an area on the plat shown on that contour map and that slope category map, then we don't know what it is, and the future property owner doesn't know what it is. And so we don't know what to tell them at the time of building permit because it's not identified within the subdivision information. And so there may be a note still on the face of plat if it exceeds 15% or whatever, but we don't know how to coach them one way or another if it's left blank in the permits or the subdivision submittal. And so that's, again, part of the benefit or part of the reason for having a slope category map for the entire site is that there isn't any ambiguity in the submittal or the parcel for a future property owner. So again, they know what to expect.
But you still don't want to rely on that down the road when they get a building permit. You still want to make sure they go out and do their work at that time to verify the conditions at that time.
True, but again, we don't know what to tell them. They're going to give us an application for a building permit. It'll include a site plan. It'll include maybe a driveway going to that area, but we don't know if it's 15% or more. We do have a slope category layer in our mapping software. But again, like Rebecca mentioned, it's approximate, and it's not as good a quality as the material that you guys can provide. And so we don't know what to tell them until it either requires, because we get building permits that are simply just an application and a site plan.
Yeah.
They haven't gone through the exercise of doing their site disturbance plan, hired an engineer, and so on. And so they may not even be able to answer the question for us whether it exceeds 15%. So that requires, a site evaluation, and that creates additional work for everybody involved, when it should, as the code requires, to put future property owners on notice. This is what you should expect when you decide to purchase and then further develop.
Yeah, like I said, no, my only concern was I think the note is much more appropriate than a building envelope, because the note says if you're going outside these areas, you got to do additional work. Where the building envelope restricts you, where now you're stuck in the plat didn't accomplish the intended purpose, you got to redo it just because it didn't consider every possible way you could look at the property.
Yep, and so I guess it would be upon, the developer, the property owner, to decide how they want to proceed. Okay. They can proceed with, if they just want to put the effort of this area and surveying this area, it saves them money by doing so, then they should expect then that's going to cause them to have an envelope for that particular area. If they don't want to encumber their plat with building envelopes, then they again should expect to fulfill the rest of the parcel.
I just wanted to add a comment to the question. And, the system works really well as long as you don't put that building envelope on the plat. You gotta, if you change you can change the building envelope. The application process requires that you demonstrate that there is a buildable site on the lot. And that makes sense, but it's not binding until you put it on the plat. I've run into the same thing where we started showing building envelopes on the plat, and we were instructed to take them off, and after we were instructed, that made sense. I just wanted to add another comment with regard to the 15%. Just put a flag on it, maybe look at it in the future. 15% is a site-specific consideration that's a function of soils. We've got subdivisions where it's essentially rock, and there's no need to do a geotech report in that condition. There's other instances where 15% is it's clay, there's water. It does warrant a geotech report, and so I just ask you to consider doing something with that 15% to streamline the process.
So my question to you would be, if we are not getting a geotechnical analysis up front that is telling us that we don't need a further geotechnical analysis, how do we have the information that knows that on that site-specific site you do not need a geotechnical analysis?
I'm referring to.
Yeah.
You're right. Part of the application process legitimately includes a geotechnical analysis of the subdivision. If the subdivision soils don't warrant further consideration, say due to rock, then I'd say that could be considered to be waived. It's just creating additional work unnecessarily. A hold up to get a geotech report for a site that is completely stable at 15%.
But how would we know that, Bart? That's the question that we're posing. If we don't have a preliminary geotech.
Because we would be submitting a geotech evaluation as required with the subdivision application.
But it's only required based on slope conditions. It's not an automatic requirement for every single subdivision.
Okay.
I guess
what we're saying is that there's a clear distinction.
We don't have to just put a flag in it. There's something there that you guys need to look at that would streamline the process. That's all I'm saying.
I will add, I have, when I worked on the permitting end, I had a subdivision that was next to a mine. It had a plat note that you needed geotechnical analysis. A geotechnical engineer gave us a note that said that mining site is not affecting this property. I don't need to do further analysis. That is completely acceptable. If the engineer tells us this is fine.
Okay, all right, I remember you said that.
Well,
but it needs to come from the professional, and that's where we can't make that decision. Yeah.
Right, I would just say, we have some limitations in what we're able to review, and that's why we rely heavily upon engineers, geotechnical engineers specifically, because we don't have the experience with soil, as some of you may, and so that's why, again, with other agencies as well, is we just rely on professionals with that specific.
So my point is that when you put on the plat that anything constructed over 15% needs a geotechnical report, then it's binding. Then the buyer wanting to build needs to hire a geotechnical engineer to build it. And if the site is solid rock and we've demonstrated that it's, and when I say solid rock, I'm talking about a minor soil horizon, but basically stable at 15%. There's no need to do that geotech report, is all I'm saying. You put it on the plat, then it's binding. Same thing with the building envelope. If you put the building envelope, you're kind of hung and you got to go through additional process, maybe unnecessarily, because it's on the plat.
I'd like to clarify something, Bart, and something that Rob Stratton was talking about. While a majority of the geotech analysis that we do get are very generic, where the geotech engineer evaluates the overall site based on some specific areas where soil core samples were taken, I have seen in some rare instances where the geotech engineer says, we base our recommendations and the reasonable utility and livability for these lots based on the specific location of these core sample areas that we have designated as building envelopes. In that case, we have absolutely no choice but to forward that recommendation as an encumbrance on the face of plat with a building envelope. And that does happen rarely, but it does happen.
Okay, duly noted. I guess all I would say to that is you guys have a site plan approval process, okay? If somebody changes the building envelope off the application, that's no big deal as long as the building envelope isn't on the plat. If the slope, you can see off the topo that it's greater than 15%, but in the site plan review process, it's demonstrated that it's essentially a rock hillside and it doesn't warrant geotechnical evaluation. My point is geotechnical evaluation is the price has gone up and they're backed up because of requirements like this. And I'm just trying to plant a flag in it so you guys can move on. I know you guys got a large, I just say, just put it out there, put a flag in it to review in the future.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bart. Yeah, I think, there's certainly areas in our code where we can consider, 15%. Is there something that we could maybe look for other situations? Is 15% the right number? So all those things are worth considering. So appreciate the thought.
Just another comment about that. The previous staff used to allow the limited topo, no building envelopes, and so we got going down that path. And the cost of providing topo on a 5-acre or 10-acre parcel is very substantial. To eliminate the requirement for a building envelope and provide topo for the whole property. So magnitude of 5,000 compared to now 10,000 or more in cost for the surveyor to produce this product.
Noted. Thank
And
you.
we have a question up here.
I just wanted clarification on the building envelope.
Yeah.
From what everybody said, so is a building envelope required to be on the plat regardless, or is it only when the property has over 15% slopes, or is it required at all?
They're not always required, so they are something that a property owner can decide that they want for whatever reason. But they also there are cases where we will require them. So we'll let you know when we're requiring them.
Okay.
It's not a huge number of minor subdivisions at this point that have them.
So it's not super common.
It's
required.
When they are required, it's usually going to be sensitive areas, so steep slope or water or that type of thing. There are other times where we say if you have a special flood hazard area. It's not,
Right.
it is technically a building envelope where we say you can't build in the special flood hazard area.
Gotcha.
It's just not a full envelope.
Gotcha, okay. That makes sense, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Again, if
I do have a couple of questions via Zoom, so I can, so going back to the public comment period, if a public comment is or are public comments accepted after the 30-day review period?
we'll put them in the file if we receive them, but we don't have to consider them.
Okay, and then I do have a question about the differences between a LOMA and a LOMAR, which we will be touching base on the special flood hazard area standards. So we'll make it a point to address that question with our general standards section. So appreciate the question, but let's just put a pause on that one for the moment. And then the last question I have, which I think we have kind of addressed already, but it says, has anyone seen the tribe future land use plan yet? And at this point, again, there hasn't been any new information provided to us by the tribe, so not at this time.
I will just reiterate, if you receive reports from other professionals and you have questions about them, or you want us to talk to the person who is making them, hydrogeologist, whoever, to make so that they understand what we're looking for in it, we're happy to do that. I understand they don't always know, and that's also the case for particularly small public or private water districts who have not dealt with us. So, next Vlad's going to talk about major subdivisions.
Did we want to take maybe a couple minute break, or how does everybody feel? People are taking a break. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Once again, Vlad Finkel, planner with Kootenai County. I will be talking to you guys about the major subdivision process. As a majority of you know, if not all, the major subdivision process involves more than 4 lots being created, 5 or greater. From one of the most common questions that we get at a pre-application meeting is, what is the process for a major subdivision? And I think in a nutshell, if you're looking at it from a 10,000 foot level, you got sort of 3 steps. You got preliminary approval process, which requires a public hearing. Then you have a period of up to 2 years to construct the necessary infrastructure improvements associated with the request upon preliminary approval. And then, of course, you have the final plat review process. And I want to clarify that the second step, as it relates to the construction of of subdivision infrastructure improvements, that could be significantly decreased in time by submitting appropriate bonds, whether it's to the public agency with jurisdiction that will take on those improvements, such as a public road, a water system, or a septic system, or a wastewater discharge facility. So in that regard, you could significantly reduce that time by simply providing appropriate completion bonds as are allowed based on our subdivision ordinance to those agencies. Submit documentation including a design professional estimate of the proposed improvements, a completion agreement, and that would suffice our minimum requirements for moving forward to stage 3, which is a final plat review process. So the preliminary application for a major subdivision is very similar to that of a minor subdivision that Rebecca had explained. Now, there are some slight differences, one of which is that a major subdivision process always requires a conceptual stormwater plan regardless of slope conditions. Whereas in a minor subdivision, that typically applies when you're working on a property that has slopes exceeding 15% grade. For a major subdivision, you would have that submitted if the property is fairly level. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, the bullet list of items that we may require, including conceptual engineering, geotechnical analysis, is based on slope conditions, and that's typically when you have slopes exceeding 15% grade. In some cases, you may have a flat property, but you do have a high water table, like in the rimrock area, where a geotechnical evaluation would be necessary. And you may ask, well, why would you require that? Well, as you know, if you have a high water table, that likely will present an issue down the road if you do have basements that could be inundated with water. So while a majority of geotechnical analysis, for the most part, I would say 90%, if not more, are dealing with slope conditions, there are some rare instances where you have high water table that does require geotechnical analysis, and then it would further require that the plat have a restriction that basements be prohibited, or some other significant improvements that could be inundated with water be prohibited. As it relates to traffic impact study, this is a very common question that we get. Vlad, when do we need to have a traffic impact study submitted for a major subdivision? That's a really good question, because a lot of it depends on the density that you're proposing. In a minor subdivision, typically having 4 lots created, or 3 additional density rights from the original parent parcel to 4 lots, would create very insignificant amount of traffic impact. But if you're working on a major subdivision, you could have 20, 30, 50, 100 lots that are being created. And at that point, I think the general rule of thumb, if you're doing more than, I'd say, 20 lots, then what I have seen agencies come back with, specifically the Highway District and at times Idaho Transportation Department, depending on where access is gained, is they would say, we need a traffic impact study. In majority of cases, when you have less than, let's say, rule of thumb, 20 lots, we would say that a trip generation analysis would be required. And the distinction between those two documents is that the trip generation analysis would basically evaluate AM, PM, peak trips, as well as ADTs associated with a request, whereas the traffic impact study would evaluate AM, PM, peak trips, as well as ADTs to further evaluate the need for improvements and dedication of rights-of-ways, easement, improvements to the adjacent right-of-ways, such as acceleration, deceleration lanes, turn lanes, and so on. In some cases, maybe even traffic signal. But that is a tough question, and I would recommend that you reach out to the Highway District or ITD if access is gained off of a state highway to clarify whether traffic impact or trip generation analysis would be required. So when it comes to a preliminary application, the requirements within Table 201 of our code is very similar, if not identical, for a major subdivision as it is for a minor subdivision. I don't need to get into the specifics of that. Please keep in mind that when you submit a preliminary plat for a major subdivision, it does not require a detailed surveyor packet, because the purpose of a preliminary plat for a major subdivision is to just evaluate the general layout of the proposed subdivision from the surveyor standpoint. Whereas for a minor subdivision, you are required to have a full-blown surveyor packet to assess lot closures, parent parcel closures, and other documents that encumber the property. Those specific requirements for surveyor review will come in on the tail end of things when you do a final plat application. And our fees for preliminary plat review versus final plat review are structured that way, that the fees are significantly lower for a preliminary plat from a surveyor standpoint versus final plat review. So just keep that in mind. You do not have to have a full-blown surveyor packet for preliminary major subdivision review. The fees have been recently updated as of last spring, as approved by the board. I think a majority of you are aware of that. Now, when we do a completion and sufficiency review for a preliminary plat on a major subdivision, it's very similar to that of a minor subdivision, although you are required to have more documents in place. When it comes to a major subdivision, there are some items that we do not require at preliminary stage, but they will be required at final stage. Specifically, if you are located in the WUI area, which is Wildland Urban Interface Forested Area, we will require an approved wildfire mitigation plan as part of final plat review. Can you submit as part of preliminary plat? Absolutely, but you're not required. Similarly, if you are going to have dedication of shared infrastructure improvements that are going to be privately maintained, such as roads, water system, septic system, or whatever else that may be part of your request, you can submit CCNRs and maintenance agreements as part of the preliminary review, but you don't have to. But we will require it at final plat review. So you have the option on that end. When we solicit comments from agencies, keep in mind that the agency comment period does not run concurrently with a public comment period. Agency comment period requires 30 days. Once you receive those comments, we have to evaluate them and make sure that the impacts associated with the proposal can be adequately mitigated with the conditions of approval that are going to be placed on the application. I have noticed over the course of I would say since COVID started, probably within the last 2 years, that the major subdivision review process has significantly increased. In the past, we would say that a typical review process for a preliminary plat approval runs 5 to 6 months. I have seen it extend out probably by at least a couple months, simply because the agencies are overwhelmed with the amount of work and there is just not enough reviewers. But these are some of the typical agencies that we work with, depending on the location and the jurisdiction of the agency. Once we receive all of the agency comments, we evaluate them. At times, I have seen, and please make sure that when you review those comments on your end, that you as an individual who is a trained design professional can evaluate that response with having black and white direction in terms of what needs to be accomplished through the recommendations and requirements. What I have noticed lately is that some of the responses are open-ended. Well, you may ask why. Well, what does that mean? Well, at times, especially with the highway districts, and sometimes with fire and PhD, but more or less with the highway districts, the response is the road design does not meet associate highway district requirements, or the access is inadequate, or so on, or the road design, the profiles, or so on is inadequate. We can't condition those types of responses. They are open-ended. And then I get a call from the applicant who says, Vlad, how come we're not moving forward? We got a response. Well, I'm sorry, but the 5 out of 10 responses are open-ended. You need to redesign your subdivision to show feasibility. Now, the conditions of approval are to address impacts and mitigation. Feasibility aspect of designing a lot of reasonable utility from access, water provision, or septic provision must be a close-ended, or I don't know how else to describe it. It has to be a conversation that has specific direction for mitigation. An open-ended discussion will not qualify as a legitimate response or a response that we can move forward with. So following an agency comment period, we start with a public comment period. Of course, a major subdivision process requires that we have a public hearing before the hearing examiner, as well as a decision by the Board of County Commissioners. We post the property and we do the public comment period in advance of the hearing, and at that time we draft a staff report with staff recommendations and conditions of approval that then can be placed on the approval to mitigate impacts. So when we move into a public hearing process, keep in mind that the notification distance for a major subdivision is always 500 feet. And it's significantly different. It's only 300 feet for a minor subdivision. One of the questions that always comes up, well, Vlad, we notified, or you notified people within 500 feet, and there was a total of 20 property owners, but we received comments from 50 individuals. The minimum requirements are that we notify people within a certain distance. Those who respond, there's no limit. Anybody can respond and anybody can attend. Hopefully, the people that do respond have a vested interest, or maybe, not vested interest, but are impacted by the proposal. And that could be vetted through by staff, through the review of those comments, or the hearing examiner and the board. At the hearing, we will introduce your request. The burden of proof is always on the applicant to show that they can, that the project is feasible and can be reasonably mitigated with the conditions of approval. The applicant will have their chance to make testimony. Those who are in attendance via Zoom or physically present will have an opportunity to speak in support, neutral, or opposition. The applicant will always have an opportunity to make a rebuttal. Following a rebuttal by the applicant, the hearing examiner will close the public hearing. They do not make a decision that day. They have up to 2 weeks to render a recommendation, either siding with staff's position or going a different route. And then that recommendation, once it's submitted, will move forward with with deliberations in front of the board. Now, some of you may ask, well, is a public hearing required in front of a board? It is not, unless it is requested by either the applicant or the public. In some instances, the recommendation and the conditions of approval may not be amenable to the applicant or the public. In that case, they can request a public hearing. The board will entertain it, but they're not obligated to grant it. In most cases, they grant it due to due process requirements for a fair review. And once they grant it, they will hold a public hearing. But if there's no request for a public hearing, or a public hearing request is not granted, then the board will move with deliberations. Staff will introduce the case, no testimony will be taken, and the board will make a decision during deliberations. So this, following a decision on a preliminary request, we move forward with a 2-year period for construction phase. I have seen it happen when folks submit an application for a final plat review, that a lot of assumptions are being made with respect to those improvements. At times we get recalls from the applicant who says, well, we're working with this agency, or this agency has agreed to these improvements or these conditions. We cannot assume any third-party discussions that have not been verified in writing. And unfortunately, I have to say that probably 80%, 8 out of 10 applications for a final subdivision review are deficient. A lot of assumptions are made that we acknowledge, we understand, we will consider. While in some cases, those conditions that apply to subsequent building permits on each individual lot are legitimate responses, as it relates to infrastructure improvements, this will not suffice. I have to go back and tell the applicant, okay, you have had a discussion with the highway district or the water district or any other agency for that matter that will either take on those improvements or will approve them to be privately maintained. But unless it's in writing, we cannot prepare a recommendation and sign off on it for the board to approve. It's just something we don't have the authority to. So that's why I say that 8 out of 10 projects that I have seen recently being submitted are deficient in that regard. So if you do move forward with the construction phase, let's talk about, let's say, water and road improvements. I recommend that you not just submit us a copy of road development agreement or some sort of agreement with the water district, including an estimate by the design professional, being an engineer, as it relates to the actual cost of those improvements. we need to have verification from the agency to whom it will either be dedicated to or who will review it to be privately maintained, that they not only received it, but they have reviewed it, it meets their requirements, and they are ready to sign off on the final plat. Without that confirmation, I unfortunately cannot submit a recommendation to the board to sign off on the final plat. So keep that in mind. If those improvements are not in place, but you're submitting a bond, the same acknowledgement has to be made. We have final plat review fees. Of course, the surveyor fees, as you can see, are significantly higher at final plat review because that's when they get their complete surveyor packet. But those are the fees that we adopted last year, and this is something that, you know, it's pretty common, nothing unique. So when we take in a final plat application, we prepare a recommendation based on the information you submitted to show compliance with the original conditions of approval that were placed upon a preliminary decision. At that time, if you didn't submit your CCNR's wildfire mitigation plan that are required for final plat review but may have been submitted at preliminary stage, may have not been submitted at preliminary stage, we will require that it be submitted. Agency approvals I spoke about, construction approval and financial guarantee I spoke about. Please keep in mind that in addition to a completion bond, which is 150% of the assessed or estimated improvements, let's say you have a $100,000 road that you have to improve, we will collect a $150,000 bond. The county will collect it if it's going to be privately maintained, and the highway district will receive that bond if it's going to be dedicated to them. Now, if you are submitting a bond to us for private improvements, in addition to that bond, we will collect a subdivision completion agreement with an administrative review fee. If you're submitting it to the highway district, then it's up to the highway district to make a decision what other fees they may include in addition to the bond. If the improvements are in place and they have been approved by the highway district or the water district, if those improvements are to be dedicated to the highway district or the water district, then they have the responsibility to accept a 10% warranty bond for those improvements, so that they are kept in, or so that they are maintained in their in their adequate state, and they're not dilapidating over the course of the next 12 months. If the improvements are constructed like a private road or a private water system prior to final plat review, and it's been approved by the agencies, then we will collect the 10% warranty bond. So a $100,000 road will require $10,000 warranty bond. Similarly, that will work for a water district. If it's to be dedicated to a public entity, then they are responsible for collecting that warranty bond. One other clarification I'd like to make, and this is recently something that happened. Let's say, for instance, you have a hybrid road system within your subdivision, and you're going to say, well, what is a hybrid road system? You have roads that are going to be interior roads that are going to be dedicated to a public entity. But then you have also common driveways that are going to be benefiting some specific lots. You cannot combine a bond for those improvements to be dedicated to the highway district. If the road portion of it is going to be dedicated to the highway district, then you need to show evidence that the bond has been accepted and approved by the highway district, and the common driveway improvements that are not going to be dedicated to that entity and they're going to be privately maintained, the bond is submitted to us. So a $100,000 road improvement with 150% or $150,000 bond goes to the highway district, and the common driveway, that's, let's say, $10,000, benefiting specific lots within that plat, a $15,000 bond will be accepted by the county. So make sure that you don't combine bonds for hybrid road improvements. Once we present a recommendation to the board, the board makes a decision on a final recommendation, and then we draft an order which is to be signed off at the next available date by the board. I can take any questions. I know I provide a lot of information, and we can get into some specifics of each phase of preliminary or final plat review.
I've got one question on Zoom. So going back to correspondence from the highway districts specifically, it says this: the highway districts feel that their initial letter is sufficient and do not wish to respond a second time once the conditions have or an agreement is in place for the conditions to be met. How can the county better communicate with the highway district to get the verification they need to keep the project moving forward?
I think that's a good question. Like I said, we have to make a clear distinction between those responses that have a direct list of approval requirements versus an open-ended discussion. So an open-ended discussion, once again, are those items that require further analysis, further review, redesign, and so on. So, for instance, if we get a response that says the applicant shall pay in lieu of improvements or and make these improvements, that's a directive, or that's a, that's something that can be easily conditioned. If they say the applicant shall dedicate a utility easement or a road easement or road right-of-way, that's a clear assessment by the agency. But if the highway district comes back and says the location of this access road to the subject property is poses a risk due to site distance requirements or due to slope conditions, or does not meet highway district design criteria, and it requires relocation, redesign that may affect the location of it, future future lot size in terms of net and gross acreage, or any significant change to the design of the subdivision, we can't assume that we can condition it, preliminarily approve it, and then come to find out that the redesign is not feasible. I have seen it happen before. So please make sure that when you get a response from the highway district, and we made it clear to the highway districts in the past, please do not assume that an open-ended discussion is sufficient. We will have to, unfortunately, turn it down and request an additional response.
Thanks, Todd. And I would I guess add to that is that, we're continuing to engage with the highway districts to, talk about these projects. As you mentioned before, everybody's experiencing a large amount of workflow, and so it just has caused agencies in general, in some ways, to be less responsive, just not because they're intentionally doing so, just because they just aren't able to respond as quickly as they would like. And so we certainly make the effort of trying to reach out on your behalf to make sure that we can smooth out any of those things so that the process can continue. But we're certainly willing to hear any suggestions that you may have too, so that we can help facilitate.
Or at times, Ben, what I have seen happen is, and what we have allowed is, sometimes you don't need a second formal letter or formal response. It could be as easy as an email that says the following items that were open-ended have been addressed, and we're ready to have the applicant move forward. So we are not requiring, with the highway districts, they may require a board decision, but there are some items that the highway district engineer or supervisor can say, yeah, items 1 through 5, based on the previous letter such and such date, have been adequately addressed. No, at this time we have no further comment. That's sufficient. So we'll work with you guys as long as we can close the loop on that open-ended discussion. And I think that's pretty much the same for minor subdivisions as well. Please don't have open-ended. I mean, you can't be responsible for the agency with jurisdiction, but if you do see something like that, please contact them at your earliest convenience and say, what can we do to close the loop on that? Any other questions?
You on the next one then? Okay. Alright. Hi, everyone. Amy Hilland well, I'm used to saying that in public hearings. Sorry, you know who I am. Amy Hilland. Nice to see you all again. I get to talk about the exciting portion. No, it's all exciting. The general standards. Just some items that we would probably bring up in a pre-app with you. Some of the major points, I'm going to talk about all these items, but some of the major items we want to talk about today are really the sensitive area portion, and we'll address that LOMA question there. We're going to go over some of our access improvement requirements, and then we'll end with some of the specifics on maintenance agreements and financial guarantees. Some of the planners already touched base on some of those items, but it's important to reiterate, I think. There's a section of our code, design and maintenance standards. When you're starting to design your subdivision, it's important to keep these items in mind. One thing we're seeing more often, and we think it's just because we've grown so quickly, is compatibility. We're seeing this more often. We're getting more public comment on compatibility. So when you're designing your subdivision, it is important to look at the overall area. We're finding a lot of applicants just bought that land, they want to get their piece of Idaho, and they just want to maximize the most density possible out of it. And sometimes that's just not compatible with the neighborhood. So just something to keep in mind. We're seeing more and more irregular configurations. There's more and more parcels that have a lot more slope, and that's just purely because we're growing. There's more land that we're seeing that way. Another item to keep in mind is no single lot should be divided by a right-of-way. There's other items in here too, like a county boundary line or another parcel of land. If the parent parcel is split by a road, that's already an existing condition. It's perfectly okay to keep one lot divided by a road because you're not really increasing any nonconformity or you're not expanding an issue. But all the other lots really can't be split by the road. And to the greatest extent possible, if you can, try not to cause the common driveway to also split the lot. Wetlands. So we have a layer on our map for the National Wetland Inventory. It's really just for us to start the conversation that there's a presence of a wetland. And oftentimes the boundaries are based on an aerial data that they had. So that's why we ask for a wetland biologist to get involved when we see that there's a wetland on the property. A wetland biologist will determine the actual boundaries of that wetland. I have seen wetland biologists who even submit their new data that they found to the National Wetland Inventory, so it's more accurate. So we do ask that a wetland biologist be involved. They're going to look at soils, vegetation, and hydrology to determine if it's actually a wetland. And on the face of plat, just make sure that you have the wetland and the buffer that they recommend. Streams. So if there is a stream on your property and you're very sure that it's a class 1 or a class 2, give us some data to back that up. For instance, if it's a class 2 stream, put in your narrative something to the effect that there's really no fish habitat. No, it's not used for fish migration, or that it doesn't have domestic diversion of 1,320 feet. We do work with the Idaho Department of Lands, Idaho Fish and Game, and Idaho Department of Water Resources to help determine that, but it is important just in your narrative. Just state why it's a class 2 stream. We believe you, we just need the data. That's okay. So for floodplain, if you come across a floodplain, and we'll definitely try to bring this up in the pre-app because we do have a layer for our floodplain. It is based on a study done in 2010. It's a flood insurance study. And so there's this special flood hazard area. We have areas that the base flood elevation has been determined. They're typically an AE zone is what you'll see. And then there's these areas A where the base flood elevation has not been determined through that study. and I'll get to the next slide here, but there is an A area that we have determined, it's our lakes. We do not know what the BFE is for our lakes. When you come across a special flood hazard area, there's a section of our code that requires for land division to show the base flood elevation on your plat. And you need to have a note saying that all future development must take place outside the special flood hazard area. The distinction is it can't be above the base flood elevation, it has to be completely outside the special flood hazard area. And you just have to demonstrate that there's at least 4,000 square feet of buildable area outside the special flood hazard area and that your access is outside. So here's where I talk a little bit more about A zone, undetermined base flood elevation. Our lakes, though, we did determine the BFE. And the AE zones, you'll typically see those around the Spokane River and Coeur d'Alene, but we do have some floodways that are mapped also. But yeah, other areas. Oh, let's touch on what the difference is between a low MA and a low MAR. A low MAR, we will ask you to submit a low MAR and a flood study to FEMA. It's an application through FEMA for those A zones that are undetermined. Because on the face of plat, you need to show us where the BFE is. So we will ask for a low MAR. It's a letter of map revision. It's literally going to revise our map from 2010. A low MA, you typically see property owners submit a low MA to FEMA, and that's usually seen when they're trying to show that their structure is outside the flood plain. That's usually when I see them. I don't know if you want to add any, but it's a letter of map amendment. It's just amending a certain area of their property. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going through a subdivision. They just may want to add on, and they'll submit a low MA to FEMA.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, sorry. The major difference between a LOMA and a LOMAR is the map is going to change with a LOMAR, whereas a LOMA, the map is not going to change. FEMA recognizes that these areas are approximate, and so they don't have the exact boundaries, and so they create this LOMA process for an applicant to go through. They'll essentially make a decision based on likely an elevation certificate or some data that says that this specific structure or this parcel has been removed from the floodplain, but again, the map won't change, so just issue a specific letter for that particular site.
Vlad and Rebecca did touch on this topic briefly. Just a reminder, if you're over the aquifer, we just need a professional geologist. Not over the aquifer, they do need to have a background in hydrogeology. It's a new section of our code. I believe we adopted in 2019. The specific numbers we're looking for are for an individual well, or even for a shared well. We just need to make sure that each lot is served with 1,500 gallons per day, the flow rate of 5 gallons per minute for 4 hours. If I see that in a conclusion from a PG report, that's key. Another line item we would like to see is that by digging a well, they're not going to affect any neighboring property owners' production of their well. The reason the shared well says 2 to 9 lots there is once you reach 10 lots, you're actually considered a water system. If you're a brand new water system, it needs to be approved by DEQ. But if you're just going to hook up to a public water system that already exists, like North Kootenai Water, Remington Water District, we just need a will serve letter. The key thing we look for in a will serve is that it's not conditional. We do need to know that they have the willingness and capacity at that time, not that they will get capacity in a year. It's just not going to be sufficient for our code requirements. Oh, also, for an existing water system, we'll get DEQ involved if a water main needs to be extended. Required access improvements. So this is really key portion of our code that's come up a lot more often. We really do think it has to do with the growth. The common driveways, according to our code, whether they're new or existing, common driveways are for less parcels. They only need to be built to International Fire Code standards. In conversations I've had with the fire districts, it's not simply just laying down gravel. They do need a base that can support the weight of emergency vehicles, so something to keep in mind there. Also, if there's a road or a drive, already existing common driveway that has significant potholes, filling in those might not be sufficient either. They're mostly worried about if they have an emergency call and getting an injured person out, it may cause more injury to that individual. So just letting you know conversations I've had with fire districts and what they're looking for. So I'm going to break down the road requirements. Essentially, there's two halves. There's roads that exist within the boundaries of the subdivision. Then the next section I'm going to talk about is roads that connect that minor subdivision to the nearest public road. If your road, whether it's public or private, existing or not, if it's within the boundaries of your subdivision, it's required to meet highway district standards. This last part here just talks about, this is just good planning. If future access is needed to a neighboring parcel of land, it would be worthwhile to consider easement, but we will ask that the road extend to the end of the property line. Typically, we see this if we see a lot of development in one area. So here's that second half, roads connecting the subdivision to the public road. A talks about major subdivisions and B talks about minor subdivisions. The best rule of thumb is if it's going to be brand new, it has to meet highway district standards. If it's existing, now outside the boundaries of the subdivision, it only needs to meet International Fire Code standards. So I tried to come up with a couple of examples, but I cannot think of every scenario. So I'm going to try my best to illustrate this. So perhaps in a pre-app, if you want to talk about your road design, even if it's just hand-drawn, it's beneficial to talk about it at a pre-app. So here's a good example. We have the subject parcel in black, and they want to propose a minor subdivision to create 4. There's an existing road that travels within the boundaries of the subdivision, and it already is a road. By definition, it serves 5 parcels. It's not a common driveway. Now, whether it was existing or not, it's within the boundaries of the subdivision, has to be built to highway district standards. Here's another scenario. Now, this is the subdivision is a little ways away and will only be served by a common driveway. So the common driveway, of course, only has to be built to International Fire Code, whether existing or new. But the road connecting the minor subdivision to the nearest public road, if it's new, has to be built to highway district standards. If it's existing, we at least need to confirm that it meets International Fire Code. So these are some pictures here, of course, noting some of the major differences that we see. Highway district roads are typically paved. I don't think they have to be this nice, but that's why we ask for verification from the highway district. We're going to ask them to consult. And one of the key items I want you to point out to you is item C here. If the highway district recommends that a road does not need to be built to highway district standards, or perhaps it doesn't, there's some variances they're willing to live with or some exceptions, we will honor their recommendation. There's 2 examples I've come across recently where, getting back to this scenario, they were building a new road to their minor subdivision, and it was from US Highway 95. And Worley Highway District gave us a letter saying that they will never accept it into their highway maintenance standard or maintenance jurisdiction, so they were perfectly fine with it only meeting fire district standards. That was something that was really helpful, and we considered that an exception in the verification. So that's what we look for. Okay. Oops, I'm going backwards. Road naming. So if your road is a road, it serves 5 or more parcels, expected to require a road name. If it already has a road name, that's better. If it doesn't, let's say it was a common driveway just by being the subject parcel, but by subdividing, you caused it to become a private road, it will require a road name. Our code has 2 options. You can name it via plat or through a road naming application. Best rule of thumb is if the road is entirely within the boundaries of your plat, like it's a brand new road in a major subdivision, you can name it on the face of plat. But if it exists outside the boundaries of the subdivision, there's other neighbors already have an address off of it, you do need a road name application because we are finding that neighbors want to have a say in the complete change of their address. So expect us to require a road name application. And it just helps alleviate some of the conflicts. We are seeing more people ask about appeals, and we would just rather let's resolve the conflict. Keep going backwards there. Okay, we've been over this a few times. These are just really good pictures. Flat as a pancake, or is it steep? Think about, you're probably going to need to give us some conceptual plans. Some maintenance agreements. More commonly, we'll see driveway maintenance agreements, shared well maintenance agreements, or CC&Rs. Those are typically what we see. Rarely do I see CC&Rs for minors, but it does happen. As long as it states who's responsible for the improvements, how much they're responsible for, and that at least it states somewhere that future owners will be, like heirs and assigns. Those are items that we'll look for. And we always recommend run these past a legal representative. We're not going to check that, but it's just to protect the current owner and future owners from future conflict. And then, of course, there's a financial guarantee. I know Vlad and Rebecca spoke about this briefly, but I want to just reiterate, more commonly we get a financial guarantee for in lieu of improvements. So this allows you to record the plat and then still be responsible for, subdivision infrastructure. The cost is 150% of the estimated cost of construction. We will ask for the design professional to give us a breakdown of that cost. The reason why the breakdown is so important is we're actually checking to make sure you didn't include any site disturbance features. So when you have a subdivision and you're going to consider a financial guarantee, you're going to actually run into two. You're going to run into, for the completion of the road, financial guarantee, and then you're going to run into the one attached to the actual site disturbance permit. So there's two financial guarantees, and when we look at the breakdown for a subdivision completion, if it has silt fences or straw wattles or anything like that, we don't want to double bond you, so we're going to ask you to resubmit those with the SDP permit. So it's our just way of just making sure the bonds are accurate. To release the financial guarantee, we'll need just a letter from the design professional that the road is complete. Now, perhaps grass isn't growing, swales haven't been constructed yet, that's fine, because we're going to capture that with the site disturbance permit. We're just making sure that it's completely there, it's built. And we may ask for agencies to weigh in, like if it still needed improvements to be built to International Fire Code, we may ask the fire district just to confirm it's done. Ultimately, we will do a site visit to close out the site disturbance permit. So that's when we usually do our site visit, but if they're far and in between, one of us will probably go out there. There's also what's called a warranty agreement. You'll usually see these with the major subdivision. And it's our warranty that after a 12-month period, the road is still, or the infrastructure is still intact. It's 10% of the estimated cost, and there's also its own warranty agreement. The types of bonds are letter of credit from a financial institution, cash deposit, and then certificate of deposit. Oh, I keep going backwards. Sorry about that. Oh, questions? It's a lot of information, and at time of pre-app, we'll make sure that we discuss these in full detail. Like if you're going to run into that floodplain, it's completely normal to have multiple meetings about it. Yeah.
So in Kootenai County, you guys don't allow development in any floodplain whatsoever?
Only if it's being subdivided. It's actually only required that you restrict development outside the special flood hazard area for platting. But we have a lot of parcels unplatted that, or even some lots even prior to this requirement. We do allow you to build in the special flood hazard area, but it has to be built as an example, the top of the lowest floor has to be 3 feet above the base flood elevation. So we do allow you to build in the floodplain if you're not, if it wasn't created through the platting process. And it all depends on when that plat was recorded. Our code has changed, so we'll definitely bring it up if it's an issue. It's a good question. Any other?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm just reading the code, and it kind of goes back to in the subdivision proving, that the land, that it's buildable. So, and meeting all the code requirements. So in your specific development standards, talking about the 4,000 square footage outside of the flood zone requirement.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can show that, would there still be a need to show the base flood elevation, even if there's 10 acres below any potential flood zone area?
Sure. Our code it's in the flood regulations. For land divisions, that's where that 4,000 square feet is. Anytime you see an unmapped A zone, or even an AE zone, it does require that you show the BFE on the face of plat. Now, if it's like 10 acre, I guess I don't really need to see like a square that says 4,000 square feet. I can definitely see there's probably like 9 acres outside the special flood hazard area. That's fine. Obviously, there's 4,000 square feet, but if it's hard to tell. Maybe the whole parcel is inundated with floodplain, and it's really hard to measure specifically 4,000 square feet. We may ask you to give us just demonstrate that it is really 4,000 square feet. Does that help answer your question?
So is it just the intent that any time you're coming across an area with no base flood elevation in this zone A, that you're going to start requiring that this LOMAR be submitted?
Yes.
If I can clarify,
Sure. I'll turn this off.
Amy, in addition to what you have stated, section 87204 subsection G land division states, item number 1, all lots created after September 14th, 1999 shall have a building site that is a minimum of 4,000 square feet in size and is accessible by a driveway which meets the minimum standards of Chapter 3, Article 3.2 of this title, all located outside of any special flood hazard area. A second item to subsection G states, if platted, the face of the plat shall indicate the location of any special flood hazard area within the boundaries of the plat, and a note shall be placed on the plat restricting development to areas outside of the designated special flood hazard area. Such areas shall be preserved as open space and left in their natural condition. So to answer your original question, yes, just because you have a 4,000 square foot area depicted on the plat as being outside of the flood zone, we need verification that that flood zone is in a specific area of the plat and that the 4,000 square foot building envelope is not anywhere within that geographical area.
Even though we're not building right now. I mean, we're just subdividing and can prove feasibility that there's enough buildable space outside of this potential flood zone.
That's a good question. So in order to show feasibility, we have to know where the flood zone is. You can't show feasibility or proof that it's outside of the flood zone without showing where the flood zone is. Those two work in concert, the 4,000 square foot building envelope as well as the BFE. They don't work, they have to be both on the face of plat in order to comply with subsection G of Article 8.7204 of our code.
So I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but when we submit a LOMA application, I mean that's free. There is no application fee with FEMA, and we get the same kind of letters from them that state, this this meets our requirements, this is what you have to do if you're gonna be within this area. The Lomar application fee is $8,000, which doesn't include the work that goes into that, which essentially gets, I mean, yes, it revises the maps, but we have the same outcome. So I'm just not sure why the Loma wouldn't be sufficient in this scenario.
They're not the same outcome. That's the difference. If you have a Loma that says that your property, the entire property is outside of the special flood hazard area, then you wouldn't need to go through the Lomar process. But you would have to do that. Usually the Loma is just showing that a structure is outside of it, and that's not proving that the entire property is outside. But otherwise, the little area that they show on our maps, it's not we don't know where the actual boundary is without the BFE.
And maybe I'll add just briefly to that, is that this does come from us, or comes to us from FEMA. So part of the National Flood Insurance Program requires that through the subdivision process that the base flood elevation or the floodplain is identified on these plats. And so that's part of a requirement that FEMA kind of hands down to us, saying that, hey, county, if you're going to participate in this program, that's fine, you can do so, but expect that with the subdivision processes, this needs to happen.
I was just going to say, through the Loma process, there's actually 3 options. One of them is for structure, one's for the entire parcel, but one of them you can do a description of an area within a parcel. And can you describe an area within a parcel and say, this area we have had reviewed by FEMA through the Loma process, and if your building envelope is within that area, does that suffice at that point?
It would, as far as I'm aware, I've not had that conversation with FEMA yet, but it would be inconsistent with my understanding and our understanding of the NFIP, requiring that information to be put on the face of plat through the platting process. It may be applicable for unplatted situations where, again, a property owner believes that a portion of their parcel is outside of the floodplain and they don't want to have to go through the process for an elevation certificate or comply with the county standards for flood development. So that may be an option to satisfy that type of proposal, but not for the platting process.
Do we have any more questions on that? All right. Cool. Now we're going to dive into some IMS. We're looking forward to your basically your feedback. Yeah.
Okay, I am back for IMS. This one should be much shorter than minor subdivisions. We're just going to talk about some logistics, go through an application with some tips, and then a little bit about searching at the end. So fun logistics. Basically, we spend a lot of time organizing files, and there are some areas where we can reduce some of that time. The first thing is just land use applications are submitted online. I don't expect this audience to be the people who would have a problem with no longer needing to give us 3 physical copies of initial plats. Revisions to submitted files should be uploaded, not emailed to us, because that's where they belong. They go into the online file. If you're having issues uploading, please let us know. We'll try to work through those. You can still send an email that says, hey, I uploaded some things to the file, or call. We also have an issue if you email us these revisions. Not only do we just then download them and upload them, it fills up our emails, and then we can't send more emails. We can't receive emails. This happens multiple times a week to me, and I think most of the other staff. We prefer PDF format and 1 file for each submittal. So for your photos, please don't upload 6 JPEGs and then a map that's also a JPEG or a PDF. then we are downloading each of those, PDFing them, putting them into one file, re-uploading them, and voiding all the original submittals. Plat pages, we'd like them all to be the same. If you have built features map, that's not needed on the final map. That can be its own page, but the signature page and the page that actually shows the boundaries should all be all in one submittal. If you need to reduce the size because they're super big and you can't upload them, that's probably the case. For major subdivisions, Vlad would like the agency comments to be individual files because they each get their own exhibit number. So if you combine them all into one file, then he downloads it, separates them all, and re-uploads them. This is also the case for sometimes we see narrative, photos, title report, maybe the plat all in one file. In that case, download it, separate them, re-upload them all. And please also do not give the submittals your own exhibit numbers unless they are like appendices to a report. So if the groundwater quantity report has an appendix with an EMS survey and they stick all the well logs in an appendix, that's okay because that's all part of the groundwater quantity report. But again, if you refer in the narrative to the title report as being Exhibit G, I'm also giving the title report a different exhibit number that's going to be like A-05, so it can be very confusing if you do that. You should just be able to reference title report. You shouldn't need to give exhibit numbers. I realize this has changed over time. First, since we started moving into eTrackIt and got rid of the paper files, and then also as we've moved over to IMS, but this is currently how it's working. If you're applying online, the first thing you do is you apply for a project and it comes up with application types. Subdivisions and plats is the pretty clear one for major and minor subdivisions. If you're wondering where relocation is, I can tell you that I don't actually know which one of these relocation goes under. I think it's administrative approval, so if you don't know, just ask. We should be telling you that at pre-app. Next step, when you're, it asks you for location, you can type in AIN, parcel number, or start typing in address. You wait for it to search, and then it'll either come up, if you're just typing in all the digits of the AIN, it should come up with one thing. If you're doing an address, it might come up with a bunch. Then you select it from there. So make sure you select it from below. If you're doing, it's usually a major and you have more than one parcel, you just pick one. Make sure that you put the other parcels like in your narrative. We would like to get rid of the paper applications. So right now, Vlad would still like you to give the paper applications because that's always where you have all the parcel numbers in there. But that should also be in the narrative so that we can start getting rid of those paper applications. And then we'll attach all the other locations after that. I skipped over the step where you enter in the title and details because that's what you're doing. You're putting the name of the subdivision. Some of the other details, steps that you go through, it'll ask you applicant is owner, and then the toggle yes or no. If the person filling out the application online is not the owner, this should be no. Then it will ask you for a notarized authorization. If you say yes and you're not the owner, it will not ask you for the notarized authorization. You may not then remember to upload it, and then we'll just have to ask you to upload it later. So none of these are trick questions. We're just letting you know why we do it. The lots in the open space tracts, which is tracts that are, road, open space or utility tracts, you enter those in, and then that helps with the 15 lot fee for the surveyor. And then the major subdivision 50 lot fee. So that's what those are calculating. On the other thing, or the right side, change in legal description. If you did a boundary line adjustment since the pre-app, just select yes, then we're not confused when we are looking at our map and looking at the plat and they don't match. Lets us know. You should also probably include some information in your submittals. The next here are pretty explanatory. if you say yes on sensitive areas, it does not then come up with a big screen that says denied. It's just letting us know there's sensitive areas. And then please put your pre-application number in there. If you don't have a pre-application number, it should be in many emails from us. If it's because you haven't done the pre-application, you should pause, wait till you have done the pre-application meeting before you move on. It will save it in your drafts. Moving on to contact information, please only put the owner's information under the owner's contact information. This is so that we can contact the owner. We're not going to contact the owner for every single thing unless they ask us to. If we have a correction on the survey, unless the owner is a surveyor, why would we ask the owner to fix it? Everything else should be whoever it is, and then just some things to point out. If you click the me, it will fill in everything in that box with your information from your IMS profile. There's that icon with the 2 pages is so you can copy things from one tile to another. So you can, if you are the applicant and the surveyor, you can copy them. And then delete is the little trash can. The key to file uploads is there's a little header at the top that says what you're supposed to be uploading. So here it says upload 6 photographs and key. That's what you should be uploading. If it's an optional submittal, like conceptual site disturbance, you can skip it. If you're combining site disturbance, stormwater, and engineering into one, which is pretty common, you can upload it as one and then just skip the other. This is one of the few where we'll let you do that. If you don't see the skip on something that's optional, please screenshot it and let us know. Next thing, this is the actual signature for the application, just so you're aware. So that I accept it actually logs it into the online file. And then it'll take you to this next page. This does not mean it's submitted. This is the review screen. So if you stop here, it's not created. It's not sent to us. We can't see it. It's still sitting in your drafts. But this is where you can add other files. There are some applications, majors and minors are fixed, but there are some applications where maybe we're not asking you for everything. You can upload the rest of them here before you submit. You can also check everything in the requested files tile. You can check what you uploaded. You can re-upload other things, swap them out, make sure that you did everything. So some other files that you might be uploading would be built features map, boundary line adjustment info, variance or deviation to standards request, the paper application. If you didn't combine all the surveyor packet information, you might be uploading them all separately. That's fine. Honestly, whatever Rodney's okay with, you can do. And then at the bottom of this is the submit button. So then you select that and it will take you to the confirmation, give you the project number. It should send you an email. And that means that you've submitted it. You can prep this all if you're still waiting on like a geotechnical analysis. You can prep it all and then add that in when you get it and then upload at that point. You don't have to do it all at one time. Next, you can search for projects, permits, which is building permits, site disturbance permits, and locations by selecting these options. You'll probably be searching by AIN, project number, permit number, or record number. Projects might be by name. The name is usually whatever the name of the plat is. This is an option. If you search by location, that's where you can pull up everything on that parcel number or AIN, all the permits and projects that have been applied for since usually 1993. And then finally, we've talked a lot about busy workload. You'll see due dates. If you're looking at my projects, you're usually going to see I'm past due on everything until we get to public comment, and then the due date gets set out 65 days. This does not mean I'm not working on the project. We have all these little tasks, which are like prepare the order of decision, create staff exhibits that you can't see. So we don't rely on the staff review due date to manage our workload. And then the next thing is just, this was a screenshot of all the projects assigned to me when I made this slide. 68 projects, 50 minor subdivisions, 18 other things. So that's what we're working with. Also, this is why it's helpful, unless we're actively in communication about a project, please use your project number. If it's been 6 months and you're coming in to record milers, I might not remember what your project number is, and it might take a while to find it. So do we have any IMS questions? Also, if you're ever having issues, we'll walk you through it at that point too. Or if you have suggestions, we'll see if we can fix it. That's it? Okay.
Well, thanks again, everybody. I know we kept you a little bit late, but I do appreciate you being here, asking the questions. Again, that's what our intent is here, is to be better servants of the public, to help you out the best that we can. And so we really do want to continue in any dialogue, any questions that maybe come up later. We've got our contact information as far as, cards in the back for those that are attending. Those that are attending via Zoom, of course, you can reach out to me. Or if you have the contact information for all the project planners, feel free. We would like to continue this conversation. So again, appreciate your time, and thank you for attending. So take care.